that you weren't going to see us again.
I'd like to be able to say, Chair, it's nice to be back, but I'm not sure that's entirely honest. But anyway, I might be accused of misleading you.
But I think the thing to do is to remind you that you're no longer a civil servant. So I suppose the first question is you did have eight months left on your contract before you left. So why did you leave?
I'll be honest and open with you, and I'm no longer a civil servant. It wasn't my choice to leave at that point, Chair, and I would have preferred to see out my tenure. But after what I think was a very successful transition to the Labour team in the FCDO, David Lammy wanted to make a change and told me that, and told me he wanted somebody who would lead the department over the years ahead and carry out a major transformation programme. So I agreed to leave, and just to finish my thought,
major transformation programme
of the department
means what?
Well,
means 25% cuts in the staff.
That at the time wasn't obviously known because I hadn't been the spending review chair, but it's not that unusual, just to finish my thoughts on this, for a permanent secretary to change, following a change of party of government. So I agreed to step down in January of last year.
Okay. I know that you were really only properly involved in the process for the appointment of Peter Mandelson for a very short time. So I think probably basically December to mid-January. But can I just take you back to a few months prior to that? Before Donald Trump was elected president, we've got Karen Pierce, who's the ambassador in the United States, a very experienced ambassador, popular with the Biden team and with the Trump team as well. We've got an internal candidate who's been there's been a process for getting a replacement for Karen Pierce when she steps down, I believe.
So, as I think is clear from Lord Case's advice to the Prime Minister, revealed in the papers given to the humble address, the last government decided in the first part of 2024 to hold an internal competition to find a replacement for Dame Karen, and that individual was recommended at the end of that process, but in the end it wasn't taken forward because the general election was called and the appointment process was frozen under the rules that apply on significant decisions during an election period. So it was...
I see. I didn't realise it was pre-election. Right.
It was before the election.
Okay, cool. So let's go to late summer, early September. What discussions were taking place about an alternative candidate then?
I wasn't involved in any discussions at that point.
Right, and then 2 months later, we have Peter Mandelson announced as ambassador to the United States. Were you? I mean, at what stage were you involved in any discussions?
Yeah, no, good question, Jay. Look, I was first involved when I was in mid-December told of the Prime Minister's decision to make a political appointment as ambassador, and that political appointment was Peter Mandelson. So that was when I was first involved. It was, if I recall right, the 15th of December, so the beginning of the week that ended with his announcement.
Okay, and then from the first tranche of the humble address papers, we've seen that between November the 11th and December the 11th, the Prime Minister's PPS and Private Secretary for the Foreign Office give advice. We see the then Cabinet Secretary, Sir Simon Case, give his advice, and we see the due diligence carried out by the Cabinet Office, but we don't see advice from you. I mean, it may be for members of the public. That seems surprising that you're not, were you ever asked your opinion about appointing Peter Mandelson as ambassador? I mean, you were in charge of the Foreign Office.
The first I was aware of the decision was when I was told on the 15th of December. The first I was aware of the advice that had gone to the Prime Minister, or indeed that it was being formulated, was when I read it in the humble address release papers. I wasn't involved. I wasn't told a decision was coming.
Would you have expected to?
I think it is, well, I think two things on it. I think one is, on the face of it, it is reasonable for the head of the Foreign Office to be involved in thinking around what is our major top bilateral ambassador post. On the other hand, given clearly the Prime Minister was deciding to make a political appointment, I think it is also reasonable that civil servants would not be directly involved in discussions around what is a political appointment, because in the end that is a matter for elected politicians, and I can also see the sensitivity. So I'm a bit conflicted. I mean, clearly, I think ideally you want to have a situation where there is a tight and small circle of people who can be consulted on a big decision like this on a basis of trust. But I can also see that in the end it was a political matter, and I suspect, I have no knowledge of this, was discussed in political circles at the top of the government.
In a circle of trust, do you think you'd have a place?
Look, not in a political conversation, no. But in the end, this is an appointment to the most senior job in our foreign service. I was head of the diplomatic service, so I think it is possible, without asking me as a civil servant or any head of the diplomatic service, I think it is possible for them to be involved in a conversation, for example, around what are the requirements? What does the UK need in the period ahead, and that sort of thing, even if that isn't, you're not then involved in the absolute decision-making discussions around individuals who are politicians, because it's a political appointment.
John.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just follow up one or two of the questions from the Chair? You said that the process had been underway for an internal competition, but come the general election, it was frozen. Once the new government had been elected, was the process not then recommenced?
Well, I wasn't involved, as I said, so I don't know whether that was considered very much. Obviously, you have seen the then Cabinet Secretary's advice on that, and that's all I know about it, is that advice.
The Foreign Office must have been continuing to look at potential candidates to replace Karen Pierce.
The view, Karen Pierce had basically been agreed formally, as the notes say, to stay until January 2025. I took the view that actually what made most sense was to know the outcome of both the UK general election, but also the US presidential elections. And obviously there was, until the election was called, there was an uncertainty around the timing of the UK general election, given our political system, with an end point of January 2025. Karen and I had discussed, therefore, whether or not, if required, she'd be willing to stay a bit longer while we were able to see how those two elections played out, as it were. So there was flexibility. So to answer your question, in terms of September of 2024, that was before we knew the outcome of the US elections. The new government was only just in, so the FCDO and I were not actively looking at that point for candidates, because I felt we had time to see the outcome of the US elections, and Karen had shown flexibility over exactly when she ended in the beginning part of 2025.
And when were you first told that it was likely to be a political appointment?
When I was told of the Prime Minister's decision.
15th of December?
Yes.
Until the 15th of December, you had no information that any discussion had taken place, or certainly that a decision had been reached?
No.
And when you were told that a decision had been reached and it was Peter Mandelson, did you express any concerns about that? I was,
as I say, I was told of a decision, so I wasn't asked for advice. I was told a due diligence process had been carried out, and I think this is known now, as the Prime Minister had been made aware of the risks and had accepted those risks and decided to proceed. So I then moved on to a conversation, was asked for advice on the practical steps required to meet what was the Prime Minister's decision, and then the requirement around the timescale.
You say the Prime Minister had been made aware of the risks, but he hadn't, because the developed vetting hadn't been carried out. So all that had taken place was the due diligence. Did you ask whether or not developed vetting had been taken out or had taken place? Or whether
it was clear at that point that vetting had not taken not taken place. It was, it was clear to me at that point the step that had taken place was due diligence, not vetting.
Can I just ask you, do you remember who it was that was telling you these things?
I had a conversation with the private secretary in number 10.
Right.
And did you express a view as to whether or not developed vetting should take place before an announcement?
Yeah. So on that, later that week, as we were taking forward the practical steps required, the Cabinet Office initially said that as Mandelson was, to use the technical phrase from the guidance, a fit and proper person as a member of the House of Lords, he did not require developed vetting. I mean, to be honest with you, I thought that was odd and insufficient. I'd been Deputy Ambassador in Washington and therefore occasionally chargé, and I knew very well to do the job effectively, you have to be party to some of the deepest secrets that the UK government holds. But I also recognised that the situation was unusual, and I therefore asked for advice, although I was pretty clear in my own mind, from the FCDO security team. They came back to me after discussions with the Cabinet Office and said that their advice was that he should have DV, and I absolutely agreed with that. And by then the Cabinet Office had reflected further, and they also agreed. And that, if I remember right, that conversation started at the back end of the week of the 16th of December, at the time the public announcement was made, and then by the beginning of the following week, just before Christmas, it was clear that that was going to be the requirement. That's what I thought, as it were, and I endorsed the advice. And at that point, Mandelson was sent the forms that you need to fill in to kick off the whole process.
I mean, we have had a bit of a he said, she said on this. We've got the Cabinet Office saying that the Foreign Office asked, does he really need DV? And the Cabinet Office saying that the Foreign Office asked, does he really need DV? But you're down on the Foreign Office's side, that it was the Cabinet Office that said it first.
Look, I can't promise you who said what first.
Right.
I know what I was told. I was told the Cabinet Office suggested he didn't require DV. There clearly, self-evidently, was some further back and forth and consideration. And, I don't want to give you an impression that when we were taking forward the DV, there were people in the centre still saying, don't do that. By the beginning of the following week, everyone was agreed that he should have DV, and therefore it was now about taking that process forward. But I've given you my account of my memory of what I heard and what I thought at the time.
One thing is for sure, nobody made a note of it.
In the end, these are about practical arrangements rather than things which, are under, Chair, I know you've talked in previous hearings about civil servants writing everything down, but I also agree with those who said to the committee that actually, if you're going to get work done, you simply cannot and do not have time to record every interaction. The key thing is, what was the decision? The decision was he required DV, and that is recorded.
So the decision was he required DV. That was your view. It was the view of the Foreign Office Security Department. Yet we know that prior to his obtaining DV clearance, he was given access to information which would usually require DV to have been completed. So how did that come about?
So you had I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 pages, but it's certainly lengthy and thorough response from the FCDO yesterday. You sent them a very long, not very long, I don't mean that critical way, a list of questions. I didn't mean long in a critical way. A list of questions, and they're very good questions. I think there are good answers in the FCDO's response. I recognise them from the consideration of the time. The context I was going to share on this point is you have a publicly announced ambassador designate to do the single most important ambassador job for the UK. You have a very, very compressed timescale you're being asked to meet for them to start their role in Washington. And you have the exceptional circumstances of an incoming Trump administration and a very high premium, therefore, in the new ambassador arriving as well briefed as possible in the short time available, recognising that normally ambassadors have have several months to prepare for big jobs like this, and that required Mandelson to have access to briefings and papers to allow him to be properly prepared. And so, as reflected in what the Foreign Office said to you in the note last night, a decision was taken in line with the guidance that he should be given access to the building and access to the paperwork, in particular on, for example, the UK government's preparations and policies towards an incoming administration, and I was given that advice and I endorsed it, and I signed off on it, and I think it was the right thing to do to make sure that, as I say, the Prime Minister's choice for ambassador was properly prepared when he started his job. I think it would be very odd not to do that.
It does look odd though, because he's got a green pass, which just means that he's got DV, and he had a DV pass on the very day that, according to the DV people, he should be recommended to not get DV. So on the day that Ollie Robbins is making his decision that it's borderline, Mandelson is wandering around the Foreign Office with a DV pass. There's a photograph of him going into the Foreign Office on that day.
Yeah, I don't know the answer on the actual type of pass, and it was clear to everybody, and I can't quite remember what the letter from the Foreign Office last night said, was that, and it was, I think, clear at the time, was that he didn't have DV, and there were limits to what he could see and told. And again, I do think this is in the letter last night, but I can't quite remember. I do think there was a process in place to tell people who were going to brief him that there was a certain level of classification they could go up to in talking to him, and they couldn't go beyond that because he didn't have DV clearance.
Okay.
Can I just one final question? Just coming back to the answer you gave to the chair about your leaving your post. You said it. David Lammy told you that he wanted to make a change because of the transformation programme.
Yeah.
Do you believe that your concerns about the way in which Peter Mandelson had been appointed had any influence on the decision to ask you to leave early?
No, for a simple timing reason. I mean, I announced to the department I was leaving on the 4th of November 2024, and I didn't know anything about Mandelson until the middle of December. So the answer is straightforwardly no.
Afri, you wanted to follow up?
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to check with you. I mean, obviously, despite being head of the diplomatic service, you obviously hadn't been asked by number 10 or the Prime Minister directly or indirectly your view on Peter Mandelson's suitability for the role. Had you been, would you have wanted to raise, or would you have said you had concerns about the reputational risks that he carried?
I think that is genuinely a really hard question to answer, because hindsight is a fantastically wonderful thing, and it is hypothetical. But let me have a go at what I was thinking at the time. And firstly, it's just worth repeating. At no point did anyone consult me, ask me. I was presented with a decision. There was no space, and told to get on with it. There was no space for dialogue. You know that. I think, look, it is the most important job we have. I had been deputy ambassador. I knew the US well from 10 years previously, and obviously worked a lot in the United States throughout my diplomatic career. So I think I had a sense and an understanding of US politics, which gave me an idea of what might or might not be a problem further down the track. And so I had a concern at the time. There was a part of me that had a concern at the time that I don't know anything that wasn't in the public domain. Obviously, we know now a lot more about Mandelson's links to Epstein, but I had a concern that a man who, demonstrably from the public record at the time, and it's clearly much bigger than we all knew, had a link to Epstein, and that Epstein, through both the presidential election campaign in the US and more generally in US politics, had been and was a controversial figure. And I was worried that this could become a problem in future, not because I was expecting that we were going to find out more, because to be honest I wasn't, and who would necessarily know, but much more I just thought that it was a potentially difficult issue politically in the United States. So that is a very candid account of probably what I was thinking at the time. But there was no space or avenue or mechanism for me to put that on the table. A decision had been taken, and it was a political decision.
I mean, you mentioned, of course, the links to Jeffrey Epstein, which were in the media at the time. Did you have concerns about Mandelson's business relationships with China or Russia?
So please don't laugh, but I really didn't actually follow what Mandelson was up to in his business relationships. I kind of knew about him when he was a government minister, so I didn't sort of have it right in front of my face, and I didn't see the due diligence report. What the details of those were. What I would always believe in is a vetting process to look at issues which might affect national security.
And obviously you know the United States very well. Your previous diplomatic role there, you probably had links with people who are out there. Were you aware of any views that were expressed by the President's transitional team about concerns about Mandelson being given that post, or about Dame Karen Pierce being moved on from the post?
Well, I think there's quite a lot already in the public domain. There was, at least one tweet from someone close to Trump, reminding people of what Mandelson had said about Trump many years before when he was president. Previously, I think those around Trump felt blindsided by the announcement at short notice, shall we say, and it was clear also that Karen and her team had done an excellent job in establishing relationships and access to President-elect Trump, and also when he was a candidate, doing their jobs. That's a hard thing to do, particularly in the political climate in the US, while maintaining good relations with the current administration. And Trump, has, again, on the record, had said that he'd like Karen and work well with her and be happy for her to stay. So that's a rather long-winded way of saying yes.
Thank you.
Can I just on what you were saying earlier about the DV and the access point? It's just to be fair on you, it is page 5 of the,
Thank you very much, Chair.
statement from
Appreciate your help.
Paragraph. It's paragraph 5, and it's where I believe that it says. Lord Mandelson's private secretary should, in advance, inform people that he was meeting that they knew he did not yet have DV clearance.
Thank you.
Okay. Richard.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sir Philip, for returning to the Foreign Affairs Committee to give evidence. The Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, was reflecting last September on the discussions that were had in government the year before about Lord Mandelson's appointment, and he reflected that that you, Sir Philip, had reservations. Can you remember what you were saying to the National Security Advisor about your reservations around appointing Lord Mandelson back in 2024?
I think it was very much along the lines of what I've just said around the possibility of his known connection to Epstein causing an issue subsequently. Obviously, I didn't know what was actually going to happen because Epstein was such a toxic hot potato subject in US politics itself, including in the election campaign. So that is what I recall thinking at the time, and I can't prove this because I don't know what Jonathan was thinking when he said it last September, but my instinct is that's what it refers to.
Okay. And then thinking later on that year about the Number 10 operation, do you recall any dismissiveness in Number 10 about the importance of vetting, and if so, how was that communicated to you?
I wouldn't use the word dismissive. The word I would use is uninterested. I think people wanted to know that all the practical steps required for Mandelson to arrive in Washington on or around, by or around the inauguration date needed to be completed, at at pace, as it were, and that was it. The interest. I mean, no one, to be honest with you, no one said to me, "Look, Philip, the Prime Minister knows some risks around this. Can you really make sure that the vetting's done rigorously?" I mean, it's always rigorous anyway, but that wasn't the sort of thing being communicated. The sort of thing was, fine, he needs vetting, make sure it's done in time.
Okay, thank you. Last week, when Sir Ollie gave evidence to the committee, I said that Sam Coates had reported words around "just to prove it." And I need to correct the record slightly, because Sam Coates didn't actually report that. He didn't file a report. He did discuss it with a member of this committee. He didn't actually put it in writing. It didn't get off the cutting room floor. But it doesn't take away from the fact that his reply made plain that he had a strong sense that there was an atmosphere of pressure and a certain dismissiveness about this developed vetting. Could you comment on that atmosphere of pressure as you understood it in late 2024?
Can I just say one thing about the non-reported phone call and use of a particular word? I think it's important. I say this. Look, firstly, I didn't receive any direct calls from the Chief of Staff during my time as Permanent Undersecretary, so there was no call at all. So my interactions with him were always when others were present in a general meeting. There weren't very many of those either. This story, or versions of it, has been in the media persistently, or floating around the media since last September. There's different versions, sometimes involving a swear word, sometimes not. And I've really racked my brains, and I cannot recall Morgan with Sweeney swearing in a meeting at me, or indeed just in general. And so I don't see any substance in that part of it. And I think it's important I say that this morning, given how many people have come to think that might be true. In not answering your question, I've slightly forgotten what your actual question was. I know I didn't answer it. I did that on purpose. But can you just the headline at the end of your question? Sorry.
So Ollie, when replying last week, said that there was an atmosphere of pressure and a certain dismissiveness about this DV process, and I wondered if you could comment on the atmosphere of pressure, please.
I think where I would start is on the 18th of December, I received a letter from the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, and it's the one released as part of the humble address. I hadn't received letters from the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister very often. Most of my dealings was with the Foreign Affairs team in the number 10, as you'd expect. And the letter, as you know, basically says Prime Minister has decided, and it then goes on to say, please could arrangements be put in place, words to that effect, for a handover by the inauguration, a very compressed timescale, and that in effect is the top of the government saying the Prime Minister has decided he wants Mandelson's ambassador, and he wants it done in that timescale. So that is what creates the pressure. There were conversations around progress, but I think no one in the FCDO working on this can have been any doubt of the urgency of the issue and the importance that number 10 and the Prime Minister attached to Mandelson being in DC in very short order.
Can I help you? On page
Yes.
22 of the bundle that's in front of you, the letter is there.
Yeah, no, I've got, thanks, Joe. I've got the letter. I mean, it's clear. I mean, it's clear. Please would you take forward the necessary arrangements at pace. We would like to secure Agrimore as soon as possible, the formal agreement of the US government, as it were, in terms
Read
of
the end
Agrimore,
of the sentence.
as soon as possible to enable a handover in advance of the US inauguration.
In advance of the US
inauguration. At that point,
inauguration.
that was the ambition at the start.
He's given the job on the 20th of December, and they want him at the US inauguration on the 20th of January.
Correct.
So you have a month.
Yes. Sorry, does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. And I have another, and it relates to that time in December And I just wanted to sort of try and get an idea for some of the events that were happening in December of 2024. The Prime Minister gave a speech on the 5th of December where he talked about the tepid bath. And just to recap for people not familiar with it, he said that people in Whitehall are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. The implication was that the civil service was satisfied to stagnate and was not sufficiently reactive to political direction. I wonder whether that had any influence on the culture and the way in which the civil service was reacting to pressure around this political appointment.
I honestly don't think it did, actually. I honestly think the FCDO, once it was clear a decision had been taken and had been through the formal sign-off process with His Majesty the King, did what it always does, leant in and did its level best to deliver Minister's ambitions, in this case the Prime Minister's ambition. And I think that would have done that whether or not the Prime Minister had made a speech about the civil service earlier in the month. To be honest with you, I think that's, actually think the Foreign Office and all the officials involved in the Cabinet Office and Number 10 as well, I mean, they all acted, in my view, certainly the ones I was collaborating with, in good faith at the time to try and deliver a very, very ambitious ask in terms of the timescale, because that was what the professional thing to do.
One more, Chair, if I may. The Prime Minister said at PMQs last week that, quote, no pressure existed whatsoever in relation to this case. How can that be squared with Sir Ollie's evidence last week where he said that there was a strong sense that there was an atmosphere of pressure?
I don't think it's for me to do evidence squaring, and obviously there's going to be other conversations around this, and I don't know who may or may not be asked to consider it in more detail. I'd have to ask you, what do you actually mean by your question? And the reason I asked you that, I'm not being difficult, because I think there's two possible questions here. Question one is, was there pressure on the substance of the DV case? Question two is, was there pressure to get the DV case done in a particular time frame? And they are different time frames. Sorry, they are different questions. And I worry.
Can you give us two answers?
I can give you two answers. I actually wrote down two answers, Chair, because I think there are two questions there. And I do think some of the problem with them is people are talking past each other because they're actually talking about different things. But anyway, I can't find my answers, but I'll give them to you anyway. So should I just carry on, or do you want to ask?
No, carry on.
Answer one is, during my tenure, I was not aware of any pressure on the substance of the Mandelson DV case. Question two, was there pressure? Absolutely, and I've described it, and I also have seen what the Foreign Office said to you last night, and recognise what is said in that letter about the pressure to get it done, i.e. DV clearance, by a particular timescale. Because as I said to you earlier, I don't think anyone could have been any doubt in the department working on this that there was pressure to get everything done as quickly as possible.
And I recognise your distinction between time pressure and pressure on the substance of the vetting process. But I think it's reasonable to suppose that one can affect the other. If there is time pressure, if there's a desire to get the ambassador out to Washington, D.C. before inauguration, then you can understand that the FCDO has the delegated power to give a recommendation around developed vetting, might also then lean on the substance as well as the time.
Yeah. So, if I recall right, Sir Ollie, when he was giving evidence to you last week, said that there was pressure on the timescale, but that did not affect his decision-making on the substance of the case. And the letter from the FCDO last night says he, i.e. the Director ESND, does not assess that this pressure, the general pressure, influenced the professional judgment that was reached by himself or his team. And to be clear, I believe both of them.
Even though they didn't manage to read the last page?
Of what?
There was a 10-page document of the DV, and neither of them seemed to have read it. Was that anything to do with the time pressure or any other pressure?
I'm not aware of details of
the boxes.
Paper. Yeah, well, I'm not aware of the boxes. I've not seen a piece of paper with boxes on it either ever in my career. So, you know,
Nobody seems to have seen them. Right, thank you. Afra, you've got one question, and then I'm moving on to Abdesam.
Just wanted to ask, that given this tight time frame that there was, we're also aware that back in September of 2024, Lord Case, Simon Case, had written to the Prime Minister advising that security vetting should be carried out prior to the appointment of Peter Mandelson. But we know that the announcement, I think, was made on the 20th of December 2024, and it wasn't until 3 days later, as we've talked about, that security vetting commenced. So what would you say was the process in place at the time for the order of security vetting and appointment announcement, in your view?
Sorry, can you just unpack slightly what you mean?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could.
What would you say would be the normal order of process in place at the time? Would you say that the normal order would be vetting and then announcement?
Yes.
Or announcement and then vetting?
No, the normal order is vetting and then announcement.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea why it went the other way around?
No, the timing of the announcement was driven and decided by number 10.
Okay, thank you. Abdesam.
Thank you, Chair. So just following on from colleagues' questions in relation to pressure, what did that look like? I mean, were you receiving regular phone calls?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to, I'm not going to repeat myself, but it's important to remember the overall framing in a sense. You know, you have the letter from the Principal Private Secretary, I won't repeat myself, but that provides the overall context. There were meetings in that week with number 10. There would have then have been regular progress chasing. There was discussion around the exact timetable that went on, and so there was, you know, keen interest all the way through from number 10 that the practical arrangements required to get Mandelson to Washington in the timescale required or thereabouts was all moving forward. But in a sense, the pressure was kind of set at the beginning and just carried on. It wasn't a matter of did someone phone every day at 10 o'clock. It was much more this ambitious timetable has been set.
You referenced earlier Cabinet Office's fit and proper exemption, and you said that you thought this was odd and insufficient and unusual. Did you reference your concerns to number 10 or to the Cabinet Office?
I didn't need to be honest with you, because what I did was I asked the FCDO security team for advice, and then when the advice came back to me after their conversations with the Cabinet Office, at that point everyone was agreed that he needed DV.
So there were a number of emails that came out in the humble address subsequent to, well, prior to Mandelson being appointed. Was it normal for number 10 to be sending emails to prospective candidates?
No, I mean, I think, to be honest, I would cite, I mean, there's, you know, for example, if I remember right, and I can check if you want, Chair, but if I remember right, one of the emails attached conflict of interest forms, which would normally be a departmental matter, and it was in the end agreed that the conflict of interest should be done by the FCDO. I think the fact that number 10 was at all points trying to accelerate arrangements was a strong signal of the time pressure that everyone was under. They were also trying to play their part. They were, you know, stepping in to do things which might in the past have been left to the FCDO.
Mm-hmm. And in one of the emails it references that you had a discussion with Mandelson. What was that discussion? From
memory, I had a intro chat with Mandelson on the Friday that his appointment was announced, and that was around practical matters of how the department would support him in his preparations to be the next ambassador now that had been announced.
Okay. And in one of the emails, it references that an iPad, laptop, iPhone was given to Mandelson. Is that usual practice to give to somebody who is not yet cleared?
It's not usual, but it's not unprecedented.
Okay, and the emails also reference that he'd had briefings from senior officials at the FCDO. Were you aware of the content of those briefings?
I didn't, because obviously I wouldn't have had time. I wasn't aware of the precise every bit of it, but I was aware of the subjects that we were choosing to brief him on, and there was a kind of what you'd expect, a proper professional process run by the team in charge of our relationship with the United States to give him access, particularly to briefing on US government policy towards the incoming administration across a range of issues. And I remember seeing the list of issues, and I probably looked at it and thought, yes, that looks like a sensible list. But I didn't look myself at the briefing and wouldn't have had or expect to do that.
In none of the emails, it makes reference to him being subject to cleared vetting. So it's almost as though he's got the job and we're just going through the process. Was there anything in any of the documents that said this is all subject to satisfactory DV?
As far as I recall and am aware, the first time the documentation shows subject to DV is when the FCDO sent him what is a standard form of words for people who are going into jobs. I'm not aware of any other references in the documentation.
I mean, would it be right to assume that had the final clearance been, would you foresee a situation where the final DV had been refused, that would have been rejected by the Cabinet Office? I mean, I can't foresee a situation where that would have happened, given how he was treated, and all the emails have implied that he has the job. Would you have foreseen a situation where it could have been refused?
Sorry, I'm not sure. What do you mean by that? Do you mean, is it a possibility, or do you mean...
Could it have been a possibility?
I think, you start a vetting process, there has to be a possibility that at the end of that process someone is deemed not to meet the standards to have develop national security vetting.
Might have happened in this situation.
I mean, I don't know anything about the substance of the vettings. I really, I don't. I'm, sorry to say this again, a bit repeating what I said earlier. I at the time follow very much about Mandelson's wider life. I mean, it's not an impossibility.
Thank
I mean, it would have been a crisis if we got to the point where he had no vetting clearance. That would have been a crisis. Self-evidently, a publicly announced political appointment as the next ambassador to Washington, not being able to go, that would have been a big problem.
I mean, presumably the DV is done with an open mind. And it's done with an open mind whether we're going to do DV, and if you fail it, you're not going to get the job. And so I think, the question is that there's an email which says that he's going to get briefed in person from the 6th of January onwards, including on higher tiers. Presumably that means equivalent of the sort of information you'd get if you got DV. He's got a pass for people who've got DV. This is before he gets DV. He's on the payroll from the 14th of January. I mean, it does all look like he's got the job already.
He got the job in the sense that he'd been announced by Number 10. The paperwork had gone to His Majesty the King. He'd been announced by Number 10. We were seeking the agreement of the US government. So in that sense, he had got the job.
What's the point in the DV?
Because to do the job, as I said, sorry, I should take the irritation out of it. I'm not irritated, but because to do the job effectively, you have to be able to have access to information that is of its sensitivity requires DV. So that's why he needed DV. If
he'd been failed, he would have had access to the buildings as if he had DV. He would have had access to information as if he'd had DV, and he would have failed it because he would have been seen as a security risk. And you would have exposed yourselves to him as a security risk during the period.
I don't agree that with your kind of characterisation of as though he had DV. He had access to the building, but parts of the building where people without DV also have access. He did not have access.
Why did he have a green pass?
He did not. I don't. You'll have to ask the Foreign Office about the passes. He did not have access to the parts of the building where you absolutely do require DV. And on the paperwork, and I think this is in the Foreign Office letter, he had access under the rules as allowed as a fit and proper person and a member of the House of Lords. He had access to papers up to a certain level of classification. He didn't have general access. He wasn't able to roam free, if you like, in terms of access to information across the department. So I can understand why it looks odd. I actually think it was the right thing to do to ensure at the time that in the short time scale that had been given, he could arrive in Washington properly prepared. The alternative would have been that we would have had an ambassador to the United States turning up not properly or fully briefed on the government's policies towards an incoming administration, and that would not have been right. It wouldn't have been proper for the Foreign Office to operate in that way. So I'm comfortable that it was the right decision at that point in time to give him that limited access under the rules.
So is this a fair way of putting it? That given that he'd been offered the job on the 20th December and you've got Christmas and New Year in the way and he's got to be getting to Washington by the 20th of January, you were doing everything that you could to accommodate him being ready for that date?
Within the rules.
Was there a contingency plan in place for what might happen if he wasn't granted security clearance?
No.
Well done.
Yeah, Edward.
Sorry. Edward.
Thank you, Chair. So, Philip, you said that you were informed by the Principal Private Secretary in number 10 on the 15th.
18th.
On the 18th.
Sorry. I know the word principal. I was informed by our Private Secretary number 10 on the 15th.
On the 15th.
Yes.
That the Prime Minister wanted to appoint Peter Mandelson.
Yes.
Was that a conversation? Because there's obviously then subsequently the letter.
Yeah, I was phoned up.
You were phoned up. The letter just references the desire to appoint Peter Mandelson. Your letter to the Private Secretary, to the King, says that the Prime Minister has indicated his intention to recommend a small number of political appointments. So when you had the conversation on the 15th, that presumably was that the PM will make a number of appointments.
To be honest, I can't recall. I don't think it did. I think, to be honest with you, I think that the first sentence of my letter, that was a catch-all sentence, which I think was the way it was described to your colleague in your hearing with Cat Little. It was non-specific. It was a non-specific general catch-all rather than because I was being told there's more coming.
Well, so obviously in his evidence, Sir Ollie Robbins said that he was asked, or another name was floated to him, Matthew Doyle, and not only that, he was asked to keep that information from the Foreign Secretary. If not during the conversation on the 15th, at any subsequent point were any other names floated to you for potential political appointees?
Not by the Labour government. And the first I knew about Matthew Doyle's when Sir Ollie gave you evidence.
And in any conversations with number 10, were you ever asked to withhold information from the Foreign Secretary?
Ever?
Well, okay, so with the current administration, we should put on record, you have served under 4 different Prime Ministers. So let's establish at any point during your tenure as PermSec, were you asked by a number 10 organisation to withhold information from the Foreign Secretary? How usual is that for that request?
I mean, I'm worried that everyone's going to think that the centre of government spends its whole time sort of conniving behind the backs of everyone else in government, and that's not the reality. The reality is, people trying to get on with delivering the business of the government, the vast majority of the time. I think my best answer to that question is unusual, but in the end, and I'd say it's particularly around things where you might have a policy disagreement or difference of view between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State. it is not unheard of for permanent secretaries, in a sense, to try and work in a way which allows there to be a decision and a consensus view, and the government can then move ahead and take it forward. And in that sort of situation, it's not unheard of for a permanent secretary to be privy to something that they don't pass on to, or are asked not to rather, pass on to their Secretary of State. So I would describe it as not unheard of, but I don't want to give the impression that this is kind of standard operating procedure.
This is extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. So the Foreign Secretary, so the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office can be told, don't tell your boss about this when they are the Foreign Secretary. Is it? I mean, does it honestly? Has that ever happened to you before this?
Yes, it has.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you learn something new every day.
I suppose it begs the question: does that operate in the other way? Because a lot of this seems to come down to what the Prime Minister was told and when. So, how frequently are people being asked to withhold information from the Prime Minister? Has that happened as well?
I can't speak for Number 10 or the Prime Minister. I would never say to Number 10, you can't tell the Prime Minister. And I always work on the assumption if I'm speaking to Number 10, there's a possibility, and that's for them to judge, that the information I'm relaying to Number 10 might go to the Prime Minister.
Because much of this does seem to hinge on how much the Prime Minister knew when he was making a decision to appoint Peter Mandelson, and the briefing that he may or may not got. So I
can't help you with that because I wasn't involved.
I appreciate that. You said that you weren't involved in the decision-making process around Peter Mandelson because it was a political appointment. Was the Foreign Secretary involved in the decision-making?
I don't know.
Okay. I mentioned already you served under 4 Prime Ministers. Search through the records, and you can correct me on this, suggests that the only other political appointment that happened during your tenure as Perm Sec was Sir George Hollenberry, who was the former Member of Parliament for Meon Valley and was appointed ambassador to Cuba during the Johnson administration. Comparing those 2 processes and the timelines, how markedly different was the Mandelson appointment compared with the process that was taken out for the appointment of Sir George Hollenberry?
You might need to get chapter and verse on this from the FCDO. During my tenure, the only 2 serving political appointees were Lord Llewellyn, Paris then Rome, and you're quite right, Sir George Hollenberry in Cuba. I can't absolutely promise you, because I started in September 2020 at the height of COVID and had to lead a complex merger, but from memory, George Hollenberry's appointment was done before I started, even if he didn't take up post until after I started. But certainly I wasn't involved in doing anything around his appointment. I think it was already I think it was already certainly decided, even if it hadn't been announced, and then it was taken forward in what I would describe as the normal way for an ambassadorial appointment, with time to go through the steps in the normal sequence, if that answers your question.
It does, thank you. More broadly, in terms of the process then, you've already mentioned that you have never seen the now infamous traffic light boxes. Apparently, according to the letter we received last night, the departmental head of security had also never seen the traffic light boxes, wasn't aware that it was. So Ollie has talked us through the fact that he had a meeting with the head of security. Have you ever had a meeting with the head of security to discuss whether or not somebody should be cleared DB in your time as PEMSEC?
No, I don't recall a recommendation from UKSV ever being escalated to me during my tenure.
That was unique. Given that you had never had cause to see the traffic light system, should we read anything into the fact that Sir Ollie, when he had that meeting, was not shown it?
I would rest on what you were told in the FCDO's letter last night.
I'll just pick up on one point.
I'll do one point and then anyway.
So in the letter last night it says this is unusual where there's a difference between UKSV recommendation and FCDO sign-off, but it says there's more than one a month. So,
sorry, the door opened. I misheard the last end of the.
The letter last night says that it's unusual, but not exceptional, for UKSV recommendations to differ to the final FCDO decision on vetting, but it says there's more than one a month of those cases. But you're saying that they're not raised to permanent secretary level.
Correct.
Who would then make that decision?
I think that's set out in the letter. If I remember right, it sets out the decision-making hierarchy, but you would have to get chapter and verse from the department.
Thank you, Chair. If you'd become aware, Sir Philip, that there were issues with UKSV, given how high profile this appointment is, would you have raised this with the Foreign Secretary?
I genuinely don't think that's a question I can answer, because I don't know, rightly, I don't know anything about the substance of the concerns. So, and what I would say to you is that, you know, when you're a permanent secretary, you have what I describe as crucible moments, and you are basically being asked to decide something sensitive, sometimes under time pressure, and you can't discuss that with anybody. And I really don't think that I can second guess somebody's decision in those circumstances when I'm not in them and don't have the information and the environment of that time.
I understand, but Sir Philip, you've said that it's very unusual for security matters to be raised, and certainly in your time that had never happened. Given how unusual it was, and given the media spotlight on this already very controversial decision to appoint Peter Mandelson, and looking at that Civil Service Code of Conduct, well, there's an expectation for ministers to be briefed properly by the civil service. Would you have exercised your judgment to say, actually, this is one of those times I perhaps need a conversation with the Foreign Secretary?
Yeah, you know, I can't, genuinely, I'm not being difficult. I genuinely can't answer that question in the abstract without having the briefing, knowing the information, knowing where, you know, I can't tell you what I would have done. I just actually don't know.
I understand. Do you recall your conversation with Ollie regarding the handover of this decision? And in that conversation, did you discuss any of the pressures, whether that be time pressure or the kind of political pressure?
Yeah, I'm sure that I gave that we had about a week, but he spent a certain amount of that time talking to other people and reading documents, and we had, you know, conversation at the beginning of the week, and at the end of the week we had a longish meeting where I kind of went through some of the senior personnel issues, talked about some of the future appointments that were coming up, and you know, how he might want to think about that, and what you'd expect in a professional handover, and kind of some of the things that I knew or wanted him to know that perhaps weren't. You know, I was probably the best placed person to actually tell him all of that, and so I did, as part of that, describe to him in headline terms the process that had been through and where we got to in the appointment of Mandelson and the preparations for him to arrive in Washington.
And as part of that process, did you raise any concerns that you had personally about this, or any of your risks that you thought may arise as a result of it?
My memory is we had a general conversation mostly about what had happened, where they got to. The one thing I do remember discussing and agreeing with Ollie is how we would handle the conflict of interest form. I'd seen a draft of it and had commented on it, but it was, and Ollie and I agreed this, it was, I felt and he felt, something that wasn't sensible for me to sign off in my final week, not least because he was going to have to justify whatever anything was in there. So I do remember a conversation around how best to handle the conflict of interest in the transition from me to him.
Understood. In your earlier answers, you spoke to the chair about the pressure to get the ambassador in post before the inauguration, and Christmas and other time pressures notwithstanding, that's why you did the process as you did. Would you have briefed anyone else who is considered for that post if they weren't a political appointment? Let's say it was not Peter Mandelson and it wasn't a political appointment, but you knew this was the most likely candidate. Do you think that same thing would have happened?
Yes.
Okay. And on this announcement, you said that the normal order was the vetting to happen first and the announcement second, but obviously you say it's number 10's decision for it to have gone in this order. Did you know that that was going to happen? Were you aware that it was being announced?
When did I know it was going to be announced? I think probably by the 18th of the end of the 18th of December. Certainly by the morning of the 9th, on the 9th, either the end of the 18th or beginning of the Thursday, I knew number 10 were going to announce the following day.
And did you warn of any risks of proceeding this way? Did you speak to either the Foreign Secretary or anyone in number 10 or anyone else in the department?
Well, the die was cast, to be honest. So I think we had a discussion around practicalities.
There wasn't any intervention from you as...
In what regard?
That there are risks of proceeding this way, that the normal process is the vetting happens first and the announcement second. And by going ahead with this timeline, that's not the normal process. And at number 10 and the Foreign Office could be open to criticism and or process.
I mean, to be honest, I think that, as I say, the die was cast. The Prime Minister had decided, the timetable was set. Number 10 wanted to announce.
Thank you.
I still don't understand this, because if the die was so set that you weren't in a position to say, I don't think this is a good idea, I think you should do DV first before the announcement, and yet you say it still wouldn't have been a problem. If he'd failed his DV, we would have announced that.
I think the difference is if there'd been, and I'm talking the generic here, obviously, because I don't know anything about the substance, but generically, if there'd been sufficient material, in any case, you've got, you're talking about the beginning of the process and the end of the process. You're talking about, beginning of the process is one thing. End of the process is a different thing because you've got a body of material.
I think who have I got next?
Alan for one.
Oh, sorry.
Fleur.
And I've got Alan for one question, and then I've got Fleur.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Philip, I should put on record that you and I worked briefly together when you were High Commissioner to India and I was Her Majesty's then Trade Commissioner, a job for which I had to get DV.
Before you again.
Nice to see you too. The issue we're struggling with in part is judgment, and one of the main problems is that initial judgment to appoint Peter Mandelson was flawed. Some are trying to say that the FCDO process, the vetting process, could have corrected that flawed initial decision. But is it fair to say that when you look at Ian Collard's response, politicians inserted enormous risk into the system by appointing Peter Mandelson, and what Ollie Robbins and the FCDO did was use their processes legitimately to manage that risk? Or do you think they were outside of that standard FCDO process?
I don't know anything about the substance, and I have no view, therefore, on judgments arraigned around the substance. I do think what they did, as I understand it, was within the process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much, Sir Philip, for coming to give us evidence today. I've got some questions about the due diligence part of the process. Were there any other FCDO appointments like this when you were told about the due diligence and it was an FCDO appointment after the due diligence had been done?
I'm not aware for ambassador jobs of any due diligence being done of this sort of form. It's not part of a normal civil service process. So I don't recognise it.
In your experience, have you had experience of people not passing due diligence? So is it a process which is a pass or fail then?
It's not a process. It's not a standard process. I mean, the closest I can come to is, for example, this may be a total red herring, so if you want me to stop, I'll stop. But recruitment for non-executive directors of departments. Obviously outsiders, because that's the point. They have in the past been subject to a look at their social media profile and that sort of thing to see whether that throws up anything which make them unsuitable for a non-executive role in the government department. But that, I mean, is a bit different. But that is the closest comparative in terms of appointment processes to full-time on the books jobs rather than a non-executive role. I'm certainly in the FCDO, it's not part of the process, and certainly not for ambassador jobs.
And so just a bit more on the process. So you were told about it on a phone call on the 15th of December, but you weren't given the due diligence checklist, which I've got in front of us. It's part of the humble address papers that had already been completed. Did you see the conflict of interest paper at that time?
No, because it wasn't completed. Okay. It was basically sent to Mandelson, if I remember right, the following week or the week after. I'll just check to make sure I give you the right date on the conflict of interest. I saw that over the weekend of, I think it was the 4th and 5th of January, and I had some points on it. Either, I didn't, further points I wanted addressed, and so I remember actually writing an email, because it was a Sunday. I wrote an email setting out those points.
Who did you write the email to?
My office. Someone in the department dealing with it.
Okay, and were they? So they were the concerns which would have been raised by the due diligence form about the different things we can see here. Epstein, for example, was in that.
I think I can't speak to due diligence. I wasn't involved. On the conflict of interest forms, a clear form which you fill out, setting out areas in which in your life that might create a conflict, and then there's a process with the line manager, and the Ambassador Washington is managed by the permanent Undersecretary to agree whether that conflict's surmountable or not, and if mitigations and so on.
And is there a precedent of you seeing a due diligence form? Do you think or for asking? I know this is an unusual appointment because the Cabinet Office did the due diligence, so you didn't see it. Could you have asked for the FCDO to also do due diligence, seeing that you were going to be Peter Mandelson's line manager, and so that you were directly responsible in that way?
Yeah, if I remember right, I think I asked to see it and was told it formed advice to the Prime Minister, and therefore wasn't something I could see. Look, I think what you're suggesting is that I've been told the Prime Minister had due diligence done. He's seen it, decided this, and I'm going to say, well, that's not good enough for me. I'm going to do my own due diligence. I don't think that's plausible. Obviously, there was the pre-existing conflict of interest process and national security vetting processes which were gone through.
Just to be clear, in that week, I think you've been asked before about did you raise this with the Foreign Secretary? So this week of the 15th, you were told, the 18th it became public. Did you have a conversation with the Foreign Secretary during that week to say, this is the most high-profile appointment. It's a very controversial appointment. It seems. I was clear in my own mind that I needed to know the Foreign Secretary was content before I went to His Majesty the King to seek his agreement. Diplomatic service appointment, ambassador, ultimately, obviously Prime Minister involved as well, but responsible to the Foreign Secretary. If I remember right, the Monday was the day of the annual Australia-UK ministerial meeting, which both the Foreign Secretary and I, pretty busy, both in our own rights. My counterpart was here as well as Penny Wong, but also together in joint meetings for much of the day. My memory is that I had a brief word in the margins of that to relay to the Foreign Secretary what I had been told. And if I remember right, he said he would talk to number 10. Okay. So you were told by phone call, then you were in the same meeting together, and then you said, I've been told that this is going to happen, and the Foreign Secretary said he would have words with number 10 after that. And then did you hear anything back from that? I didn't say he would have words, which obviously can be read differently. No, let's make this very clear. He said he would talk to He would talk to number 10 about that. And did you hear back from that before it was then you wrote that letter to say he was appointed? Yes, so I had the letter from the Private Secretary, the Principal Secretary of Foreign Affairs on the morning of the Wednesday the 18th. I established the Foreign Secretary was content for me to take forward the process, and I then wrote to Sir Clive, and the letter's part of the release, as you know. Is there any record of that meeting where you had an establishment of the Foreign Secretary?
He was travelling, and I had a exchange with someone in the travelling party and had a message back. He was content for me to write. He was on his way, I think, to a dinner of NATO foreign ministers.
Can I just follow up on this? So you've said that there was, I mean, the purpose of due diligence is to look at reputational risks, yeah? And so if I was Foreign Secretary and one of my ambassadors had gone rogue, it would be for me to be answerable for that, right? So surely it's important in those circumstances for me to see the due diligence.
I don't know the extent to which the Foreign Secretary was involved prior to the Prime Minister's decision.
I don't understand what that answer is. You said that you'd asked to see the due diligence and you were told that it was something for the Prime Minister, and now you've given whatever answer that is.
Sorry, Chair, would you mind repeating the question? Would you just repeat the question?
Did the Foreign Secretary see the due diligence or not before you tell the King, I've discussed this with the Foreign Secretary who agrees with the recommendation?
I'm not aware that he saw it.
Are you aware that the Deputy Prime Minister has now said that there were worries about Peter Mandelson's appointment at the time? And he said to LBC that there was a discussion within government, but that ultimately it was a matter for Number 10.
I saw the media report at the time.
Is that all you're going to tell me?
Chair, honestly, I'm not being difficult. If you ask me a question, I will answer it. But I should also say I'm obviously not here to speak for the Foreign Secretary. You kindly pointed out at the beginning I'm not a civil servant anymore.
Have a view on the accuracy of the statement.
Just read it again. To be honest. I mean, I think you should ask the Foreign. If you want to know the Foreign Secretary's views, I don't really feel.
Yeah, but you were there in the middle of all of this, right? You were there in the middle of all of this. The Foreign Secretary is your boss.
Fair enough.
The Foreign Secretary. You're telling us that the Foreign Secretary was happy, and you told the King that. The Foreign Secretary, now the former Foreign Secretary, now the Deputy Prime Minister, is saying actually that there were concerns and there were discussions going on. Which is true.
So, got it. So I'm not being unhelpful, I promise you. Let me put it this way. I was asked what the Foreign Secretary said when I told him. He did not say, Philip, please crack on, write to the King. He actually said, I'm going to talk to Number 10.
That's it.
That's that, because we were in the margins of big important meetings with the top of the Australian foreign and security system in what is always a very pressurised period in the run-up to Christmas, and this was about a political appointment. He was my political boss as Foreign Secretary. I gave him the information I'd been told. He said he would talk to Number 10.
Cool.
A follow-up to that, Sir Philip. So yesterday, the former Foreign Secretary, now Deputy Prime Minister, said, as the Chair said, that he'd expressed worries. And you said this was a conversation in the margins. But again, back to how serious an appointment this is and the level of media scrutiny already rightly on this appointment. Did you have any further conversations with the then Foreign Secretary about these worries?
As I recall, he and I had a brief conversation. I can't remember if it was the 18th or the 17th or the 18th, so the Tuesday or the Wednesday. It was inconclusive, so he wasn't at that point saying he was content for me to proceed, and I hadn't in any case received what I asked for at the outset. I said at the outset to Number 10, I'm not doing anything until I've got something in writing. And at the point of that conversation, I hadn't received a letter from the Principal Private Secretary, and so we had an inconclusive conversation.
Did you raise any of your concerns with him for him to make a judgment to pass this on or anything like that? Was there any conversation about the worries that you both seem to have had?
I think the Foreign Secretary should speak for himself on his views and what was said, as it were. I at that point was doing my best to resolve the situation, establish what I was being asked to do by the top of the government, and then take the bureaucratic steps necessary either way.
So it was a situation that needed to be resolved during that week. Do you think the process of that week, the due diligence part of this, is evidence of, and the timings of it, is evidence of pressure or undue pressure, or evidence of due process being followed?
I'm really sorry, but I'm not sure I follow you.
The fact that, I mean, it's very, by your own admission, it's very unusual, and it was an unusual appointment of a political appointment. So it was this whole process tested the system to the limit, really, and we're looking at how the system worked in this case, but also what we need to learn for the future. But just the evidence of, you were already told quite late on in the process, due diligence had been done, then you were told he was going to be appointed, and then it was very publicly announced very quickly, and then so all of that, the timing of it, is that, in your opinion, evidence of pressure, undue pressure, or evidence of due process being followed at pace, yes, and you're in a high pressure environment all the time in your role?
The short timescale created the pressure, as I said earlier. In terms of the parts that the FCDO written I was responsible for, I mentioned conflict of interest or vetting, and other decisions. I'm very confident they were taken, albeit under pressure, properly. As I've already been clear, the number 10 decision to announce in advance of DV was unusual.
And final one from me. With the benefit of hindsight and many months to look at this and think about this whole process, where did the process go wrong? Was it at that early stage of even considering him, or was it the due diligence, or was it the vetting? Where did the process go wrong in your view?
I don't have complete knowledge or insight into the process prior to the Prime Minister's decision, so I can't answer that question.
You told us that it's the normal process to do vetting and then announcement. So for comparison purposes, when it came to the appointment of Jonathan Powell, was he vetted and then announced?
I wasn't involved in his appointment.
Oh, he's not Foreign Office.
He's a National Security Advisor, it's a Cabinet Office role.
What about when he was Special Envoy for the British Indian Ocean Territories?
Envoys are different and are dealt with differently. I honestly can't remember the secrecy on that, so you'd need to ask the department.
Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sir Philip. You talked about the short time scale causing problems. Do you think there was a reasonable diplomatic reason why Number 10 wanted the appointment done by Trump's inauguration?
Look, I think once the Prime Minister's decided they want a change of very high-profile ambassador, you don't want to wait too long. You don't want to get on with making that change. I mean, my own view wasn't essential for Mandelson to be there by the time of the inauguration. Always takes a while for US governments to form because of the confirmation process. It's actually quite quick in Trump 2 compared to Trump 1, but it does take weeks. So I was personally much less concerned and didn't see that as an absolutely essential thing. And of course, you know, Karen Pierce was willing to stay longer and be flexible within reason, and be well respected and connected to the Trump transition team. So yes, I can see entirely the point of getting on with it. I wasn't quite convinced that we had to see the 20th of January as a deadline, but that was the one we'd been set, you know, very clearly, you know, and communicated by the top of the government.
Did you say that to Number 10?
To be honest, I think, I would have been clear that we didn't have to, but I think in the end they were getting with it. It's also true that in the end, Lord Mandelson didn't go until after the inauguration.
Any other external appointments, including political appointments, but others, are there examples where somebody has started in post before they've received their DV and then had access to those materials?
I'm not aware of an ambassador starting in post, certainly externally, without DV. I mean, I can't speak for history, if you know what I mean, but in recent times, no.
And do you think the argument that because Lord Mandelson was a Privy Councillor, he wouldn't need DV clearance was credible at all?
As I said, my initial reaction was that it was odd and insufficient. So no, which is why I asked for advice. But you know, but we did also pretty quickly settle on he needed DV.
And you said higher classifications of material that he wouldn't have access to. What level of classification before he received his DV was Mandelson able to access?
I think it's in the letter, but I think it was up to secret, point 5, page whatever it is. It's in there. So up to secret was allowed.
So there were no briefings he was given above that level of classification before he received vetting?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did the intelligence agencies ever share any concerns with you about Mandelson's appointment or his access to information?
No.
Thank you. Knowing what you know now about Peter Mandelson's relationship with Epstein and everything else, do you think the DV process made the, or UKSV made the correct decision and the FCDO made the correct decision?
I'm not aware of any of the substance of the DV process. I genuinely can't answer that question.
Does it change your view on the appropriateness of political appointments to ambassadorial positions at all?
I mean, this one self-evidently hasn't worked out, but Lord Llewellyn was a brilliant ambassador to Paris and then Rome, and George Hollenbury did a good job in Cuba, and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are absolutely entitled, and it's explicitly allowed for in the legislation, to make political appointments. So I don't have any objection. I mean, clearly, when I was head of the diplomatic service, I was head of the diplomatic profession, and inevitably you kind of, you're not quite chief. You're head of the tribe, even if you're not chief trade unionist. So, within reason, they're a good idea. But personally, as a diplomat, I would argue that the vast majority of jobs should go to diplomats, but they have been successfully used in the past.
Okay. And finally, do you think the Prime Minister's statement that full due process was followed is a fair description of what happened in Mandelson's case?
I'm going to dodge. I'm really sorry, but I just actually don't think it's for me to sit here it's not for me to, it's for others, including, all of you as members of Parliament to come to a view on that.
So as your permanent secretary, would you have said in another case?
Okay, let me. I mean, I'm not going to answer your question. Let me describe what I've said to you, in my mind to you today. So as I've said, I think the processes, the FCDO, the bit I was responsible for, followed up until I stepped down on Sunday the 19th of January. That was proper process, done at pace as we were asked. It was unusual, and I wasn't involved in this, I was involved but not responsible. It was unusual for the announcement to be made before he received DV.
Thank you.
I've got a question from Edward and from Afra, so let me go to Edward first.
I think it sort of follows on from what Alex was asking you, Philip. You're requesting to see the due diligence report. You're flagging to the Foreign Secretary that you have concerns. So Ollie in his evidence told us that this was the only time in which the Security Department requested to see him in respect to whether or not to grant clearance. You've told us that during your tenure there was no situation in which you'd met with the Security Department regarding granting clearance. Is there any precedence for this number of red flags to be raised on an appointment?
I think that's really an impossible, I'm sort of tempted to I don't know, that's a really an impossible question for me to answer. If you're talking about, no, it is, because any appointments, you want me to narrow it down? Previous governments of different political persuasions over time have made, shall I say, not the smartest appointments in a whole different areas. But if you ask me, if I reframe your question as around an appointment to an ambassadorial role during my tenure, then the answer is yes. Or no, rather. I mean, not as many, whichever agrees with the thrust of your question, but that's yes or no.
Okay. All right.
Good answer.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a very quick follow-up question to one of the ones that Alex talked about to do with the types and levels of classified information that Peter Mandelson saw prior to going out to the US. would you have expected the ambassador to the US to be briefed on and to know what was in the China audit?
So I'd left, unfortunately, before the China audit had been completed. So I'm slightly hamstrung by knowing the absolute classification of that and quite how it, because some of the things about our China policy obviously are very, very highly classified. So I'm not ducking, but I don't really know, because it may be actually there was, and it also, if I remember, it wasn't complete at that point. It wasn't completed before I left. So my guess is on China, Lord Mandelson would have been told a fair amount, but there would have been some things which were a higher classification that he wouldn't have been able to know until later. But I'm surmising rather than knowing, to be honest with you.
I mean, so I completely understand that. You said you're guessing that. But were you aware that it was expected that briefings would include some information about the work that was being undertaken as part of the China audit?
I would have expected him to have been briefed on the evolution of the government's policy on China, so that he was ready to talk to the US administration about the UK government's policy on China, i.e. doing his job, and that must have included, therefore, him being briefed on where the government's audit of China policy had got to, if that answers your question. So you said basically yes.
Thank you.
Alan and then Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Philip, was the correct process followed in the dismissal of Ole Robbins?
Save the easy questions for last. Look, I don't think I can answer that question, and it's clearly going to be a matter of, or may become a matter of formal legal dispute. I guess what I can say is when I was Permanent Under Secretary, there were a number of very serious disciplinary cases during my time leading to dismissal, and they all involved some process. But only the Prime Minister, Sir Ollie, and those involved know what happened, and I don't. So I can't answer your question.
But in your cases, you would probably see someone suspended and an investigation taking place, or something as summarily dismissal as we've seen?
In a serious gross misconduct case in the FCDO, so for an FCDO member of staff, however serious, in my time, it was going to suspension and at least one case removal from post for overseas ambassador, and then a very short period to do a formal process.
Thank you. I want to ask about the due diligence report, but does anyone else want to come in on?
I think Uma wants to come in on the back of that, if you don't mind, and then we'll go back to you again.
Thanks, Chair.
The question, Sir Philip, on the judgment about the reasons for why Sir Ollie left post. Would you have informed Number 10 or the Prime Minister of the concerns about Peter Mandelson and those leaked emails and the emails released by the US Department of Justice after the decision to sack Mandelson? If the view from the civil service is that you don't inform your principal before, surely after, when all this information's in the public domain, would you have intervened?
I don't think I can answer that question for the reason I sort of gave earlier about not being in the moment. I mean, I recognise the Prime Minister clearly believes genuinely he should have been told. So Ollie set out for you his view, including, if I understood him right, that he felt he was bound by the rules not to discuss the information from the vetting process, although that's now disputed, and you had different evidence from Cat Little. So, and I personally think it's a very good thing that someone as Adrian Fulford's stature has been asked to look into this, because we can't be in this damaging situation again. But I'm afraid I just actually can't answer your question, but we do need a proper look at this, because it is very damaging.
I'd agree, Chair, if you can let me ask one final question. This is a hugely significant decision, this appointment. It had national and international repercussions as well as reputational risk. there's a well-publicised friendship of Jeffrey Epstein, and the FCDO and the civil services view time and time again has been that they can't intervene because the rules don't let them intervene, or to take a passive approach. Do you think, given everything we know, the system should be changed going forward?
I don't know the answer to that question. Which is why I'm pleased that it's Adrian Forward, who I know from his time when he was, I think, the first head of the investigatory. He was the first investigatory powers commissioner, and also, if I remember right, may still do, has been the final appeal for vetting cases. So clearly knows a lot about it. I think he is the right person to get actually at that question. It's definitely right to look at it.
Back to Anne.
Thanks. In the follow-up to her evidence to the committee, Cat Little confirmed there was no Cabinet Office advice ahead of the decision that Morgan McSweeney and Matthew Doyle should follow up questions with Peter Mandelson about Epstein. Have you any views on whether you thought they were the right people to do that, or whether someone independent of the process or someone trained in vetting would have been better to follow up?
It wasn't part of the vetting. It wasn't part of
the due diligence process.
Yeah, no. What do I think about that? Look, it was a political appointment with a process being run out of number 10 and a due diligence conducted by the centre in a way that I've already said is not part of normal civil service practices. So I think in the end, who is doing the questioning and whether that's appropriate comes down to who and what weight is being put on those questions and who answers them. And so in a sense, I just actually genuinely don't know, because it wasn't me making the decision. I wasn't involved in it. It wasn't therefore for me to kind of say, well, that's good enough or not good enough as the conduit for the questions. I wasn't being asked or ever involved in putting any faith in that conduit.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Anne and then John.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, we've gone around this issue of due diligence, vetting, over and over again. I am surprised that you have never seen a DV report, but is that correct?
The only papers I saw on DV was in my formal role as the permanent secretary in signing off the outcomes of appeals. So someone being refused has the right to appeal, and those papers would come to me, but they did not include vetting files. Aside from those appeal papers and the forms I filled out for my own vetting, I've never seen vetting papers.
And so that would align with what Sir Ollie has told us.
Yes.
About having only an oral briefing, where we now have him and Ian Collard telling us that this was a borderline case.
Yeah. Although, just to repeat what I said earlier, a case was never escalated to me in that way.
And then what this committee has been led to believe, I think, that red flags and denials of clearance were part of this. So I'm just... the bit I think you can help us with is the process through which Ollie Robbins finds himself sacked. Because you've been following this as closely as anybody else. I mean, just to phrase the question differently, do you understand why Sir Ollie Robbins has been sacked?
I have not seen the letter he was sent, so I cannot, and I don't speak for him, and neither do I speak for the government. So I can't sit here today and say I know. And I note also that Ollie was very clear in his evidence to you in basically saying he wasn't going to talk about that.
But in the end, the FCDO is a make recommendation department because it takes responsibility for passing clearance. It has the power to manage risks and to mitigate those risks, and that is the process that all of the evidence that we've seen shows us has happened, which also aligns with what the Prime Minister has said, that due process was followed.
That sounds right to me, and I read carefully last night the letter the Foreign Office sent to you, and I wasn't directly involved in anything after the 19th January, but it rang true.
I'll go to John, and then Fleur's going to ask the last question.
You'll be aware that a number of former very senior civil servants have spoken about how damaging this episode has been on the civil service. As a former very experienced permanent secretary and head of the diplomatic service, what is your assessment of how this has affected the civil service and in particular the diplomatic service?
I mean, Sir John, thank you for that question, because I think I'm glad you asked it. It's a very important one. I think it's also important to remember the kind of wider context. Look, the British system of government works best when civil servants and ministers, including at the highest level, work together effectively to deliver the elected government of the day's programme, but respecting that they've got slightly different jobs and roles and responsibilities. And whenever that isn't happening, and that isn't happening effectively, then you're not able to deliver as well. So I do think a situation, and you need to have load-bearing relationships at the most senior levels as well. So I do think there's a challenge now, and I think it's incumbent on all of us, including people no longer in government who can perhaps help from the sidelines, to try and get back to a situation where the government of the day and the leaderships of the government of the day and the civil service of the day have trusting relationships, understanding they've both got different pressures on them, different roles under pressure and slightly different roles, but need to work together as a team to deliver for the country.
And the trusting relationship at present, do you think, is broken down?
I don't like sort of black and white terminology like broken down. I do think self-evidently that there are now challenges, at least for some people in the relationships.
Not least people who think they're in charge of their departments, who understand that their permanent secretaries have been told not to tell them things.
I've got one more question, one more piece of the puzzle, which is about going back to access talks that you held with what were then shadow ministers before the election. Did the issue of political appointments, the appointment of the ambassador to the US, or appointing Peter Mandelson come up in access talks? Would they have been recorded?
Yeah, if you're asking to say were there records of if your question is were there records of access talks, the answer is yes.
Okay.
If your question is were these aspects recorded, I'm really sorry, but I can't actually remember the rules. But at the time, there was an absolute omerta around the contents of the access talks, and I'm going to be cautious, even though I'm no longer a civil servant, because I'm still bound by the rules about. So I'm reasonably confident actually the content of the access talks is rightly not something I can say to the committee, I'm afraid. But yes, they were recorded.
Good. Thank you very much. Order. Now, if we can, logistically, if Sir Philip is allowed to leave first, and then